They say justice is blind, but what happens when the judge himself sees a betrayal so deep it changes his entire view of the law? I was there in that quiet study, and I discovered a terrifying truth. The cruelest revenge is not born of anger, but of a quiet, meticulous sense of justice. Imagine that the two people you raised, the two people you'd give your life for, are secretly plotting to erase you, not just your wealth, but your very identity. That's the reality for Camilo Vargas, a retired judge in Mexico City. Today I'm going to show you how a few overheard words from his own children led him to create the most devastating act of retribution. You'll soon discover how he used his failing health as a weapon to deliver the ultimate sentence. Every second matters, because if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, you need to know that revenge doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's written in silence, in a will. Stay with me to the end, and you won't believe what was waiting for his children at the reading of his will and the final silent verdict they received. I'm not sure who will read this, but I've reached an age where silence becomes louder than words. My name is Camilo Vargas, and I'm 85 years old. I used to be a federal judge in Mexico City, back when the smell of tobacco and leather-bound law books filled my office more than the scent of betrayal. I retired over 2 decades ago, and now I spend my days in a colonial house in Coyoacan that echoes with memories, not laughter. It's a beautiful house, the kind with creaky floors, thick stone walls, and windows that trap the morning sun like it's something sacred. My late wife, Teresa, filled it with art, books, and dignity. Since she passed, it's just me and the slow tick of a grandfather clock that hasn't missed a second since 1952. I have 2 children, Isabel and Mateo. On paper, they're what any father would be proud of. Isabel walks into rooms like she owns the air itself, all elegance and calculation. She hosts charity events but charges them to the family name. Mateo, on the other hand, is all excuses and borrowed time. He's a businessman in the way one might be a gambler with a suit. They visit me often, but never without looking at their watches. Their hugs feel timed, their questions rehearsed, and I, the old man in the robe, nod along and pour tea I know they won't drink. I started noticing the shift about a year ago. It began with small suggestions. "Papa, maybe you shouldn't drive anymore," Isabel would say with a concerned smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mateo would chime in with, "We should look into someone managing your portfolio, just in case." I pretended not to notice the glances they exchanged, the hesitation before they asked me to sign anything. A bank document here, a property form there. I'd always say, "Leave it, I'll look at it later." Later never came. But last Thursday, everything changed. It was a gray morning, the kind where the sky feels heavier than your thoughts. I was in my study, the only room where I still felt like a judge and not just a relic. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee, sitting in the same leather chair I've had since 1976, when I heard voices, not the usual pleasantries. These were sharp, hissing words coming from the sitting room. I recognized them immediately. Isabel's stiletto indignation and Mateo's clumsy justifications. "We need to move quickly," Isabel snapped. "He's slipping." I caught him, asking where the sugar was. It was right in front of him. My hand froze mid-air. The sugar. That was the moment she decided I was incompetent? Mateo's voice followed, lower but no less cruel. "I already talked to the lawyer. If we can show signs of early dementia, we can get temporary control. Once we're in, we liquidate the assets. The house alone could clear my debts." Then laughter. Her laughter. My daughter, the one I once cradled during earthquakes, was laughing about selling my home like it was a pair of old heels. "I already picked out the Murillo in the dining room," she giggled. "God, that piece is worth more than his pension." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I felt something hollow open in my chest. Not anger, not fear. Just the cold realization that I wasn't a father anymore. I was inventory. My mind didn't race. It calculated. Years of law, of cross-examinations and evidence review kicked in like a muscle memory. They thought I was weak. They thought I was fading. But they forgot one thing. I wrote the very laws they planned to twist. That night I didn't sleep. I sat with Teresa's photo and whispered, "They've forgotten who I am." I lit a cigar, something I hadn't done since the day I retired, and I began to plan. Not revenge out of spite, but justice out of principle. They wanted to play a legal game. They had no idea they were playing against a master. The next morning I dressed slowly, deliberately. A wool sweater, slacks, my old leather shoes. I looked at myself in the mirror longer than usual. My eyes still had fire in them. Not the kind that burns, but the kind that sees clearly through smoke. I made my way to the kitchen, exaggerated a slight tremor in my right hand, and let the sugar jar slip to the floor. It shattered with a sound that brought both Isabel and Matteo running. "Papa, are you okay?" they asked in unison, their faces masks of concern poorly fitted over greed. "I think I'm just tired," I muttered. "Maybe I do need some help." I saw Isabel's eyes sparkle the way they did when she used to lie as a child and think I didn't notice. Matteo patted my shoulder with the same hand that once forged my signature on a school document. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll take care of everything." I nodded and smiled. They had taken the bait. That afternoon, I called an old friend, notary Francisco Beltran. We went to law school together in the 1960s, and while arthritis had curved his fingers, his mind remained sharp as obsidian. We hadn't spoken in years, but I knew he was the only man I could trust with what I was about to do. "I need to draft a new will," I told him, "and I need your silence more than your pen." There was a long pause. Then, his answer, "Where and when?" We met that Sunday in his office downtown. I arrived with my cane and a bag filled with notes. "I want everything to go to the Foundation for Retired Judicial Workers," I began. "The house, the stocks, the paintings, everything. Except for one thing." I took out a photo of my 2 grandchildren, ages 10 and 12. "Set aside a trust for their education. But Isabel and Matteo, nothing. Not a peso." Francisco raised his eyebrows, but said nothing. He understood this was not about money. It was about truth. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued my performance. I let them see me nap during the day, asked what day it was even when I knew. I shuffled when I walked, stared blankly at the television. Isabel even brought a pamphlet for a senior living facility in Cuernavaca. "Just in case," she said with a voice soaked in fake honey. I nodded, pretended to consider it. She kissed my forehead. Her lips were cold. During this time, I began writing a letter. Not a legal document, but something far more powerful. A statement of truth. A message to be read aloud after my death, attached to the will. In it, I described the conversation I overheard, the disappointment I felt, and the legacy I wished to leave behind. Not of wealth, but of dignity. "A man is not old when his hair turns white," I wrote. "He is old when his children stop seeing him as human." I placed the letter in a sealed envelope, gave it to Francisco, and instructed him to read it at the execution of the will. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Camilo, this is final." I nodded. It has to be. My children had built a theater of manipulation, and I had simply decided to write the last act myself. And then, I waited. The days blurred together in a rhythm of deception. I began misplacing my reading glasses on purpose, leaving the stove on just long enough to spark concern, and asking Isabel to repeat herself even when I heard her clearly the first time. She would sigh, always too loud, as if rehearsing exasperation for an audience that wasn't there. Matteo, meanwhile, started bringing me forms to review, financial authorizations, power of attorney. The bait was getting more obvious, and I played along, squinting and nodding, but never signing a single sheet. One evening I faked a fall. I positioned myself carefully at the bottom of the stairs and called out, just loud enough for them to hear me from the kitchen. Matteo ran in, panicked but also calculating. "Papa, what happened? Are you hurt?" I clutched my hip and groaned. "I just lost my balance." They helped me up, guided me to the sofa, and exchanged a look that said, "It's time." I saw it. I stored it. That night, I heard them again, this time speaking softly, but not softly enough. "He's not going to last much longer," Isabel whispered. "Let's push the paperwork through next week. I've already contacted someone at the firm." Matteo grunted in agreement. "I'll take him to the notary. He won't know the difference." I nearly laughed. The irony of being led to a legal ambush by my own son, not knowing I had already set the trap, was too rich. A week later, they staged their final move. Matteo offered to drive me downtown for lunch and some errands. I smiled and accepted. I even wore a cardigan to look particularly harmless. We arrived at an office I recognized. Not Francisco's, but one I had known for years. Inside, a young notary greeted us. "Senor Vargas, we just need a few signatures." I blinked slowly, pretending confusion. "For what, hijo?" I asked. Mateo smiled. "Just some standard updates." The papers were a full petition for guardianship, legal control over my estate, my medical decisions, everything. I looked at the pen, then at the young man, behind the desk, then at Mateo. "Can I have a moment?" I asked. Mateo stepped outside without protest. I leaned toward the notary and said with perfect clarity, "I was your professor in 1994. Third row, second seat. You cheated on your constitutional law exam. I let it go, now you owe me." His face turned white. He nodded. "Do you want me to void the papers?" I smiled. "No. Let him think I signed. He'll be dealt with soon enough." I left the pen untouched, folded the paper, and handed it back. When Mateo returned, I gave him a weak smile. Done. He beamed, completely unaware of the performance he'd just watched. He even bought me lunch afterward. That same night, I wrote one final note to Francisco. "It's ready. Activate the clause." He knew what that meant. The new will, the letter, the trust, all of it. The documents were to be secured in a vault and held until my death. I no longer needed to pretend. My act was complete. Now I could simply wait for time to deliver the final verdict. The weeks that followed felt oddly peaceful. The pressure of vigilance had lifted. I sat in the garden more often, read old case files for fun. Sometimes I'd smile at Isabel when she prattled on about antique buyers and decorators. She had no idea that the rug she wanted had already been donated to the foundation. I found serenity in the knowledge that while they tried to rob me of my legacy, I had already written theirs in ink they couldn't erase. I started documenting everything. Every visit, every conversation, every suspicious look. I kept a small journal hidden behind the bookshelf in my study, the same one where Teresa used to keep her perfume. The entries weren't emotional. They were factual, precise, judge-like. October 3rd, Isabel asked again about the gold-framed mirror. Told her I gave it away. October 10th, Mateo mentioned managing my portfolio. I nodded and changed the subject. I didn't write for posterity. I wrote for proof, for truth, for me. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if I had failed them as a father. I didn't grow up hugging or praising. My own father was a stone, present but impenetrable. I passed that down, I suppose. But betrayal doesn't sprout from silence alone. It needs ambition, greed, a disregard for history. I gave them education, comfort, chances. Teresa gave them warmth, affection, her whole being. And yet here they were, circling me like vultures in designer shoes. I had a dream one night that haunted me for days. In it, I was back in court, robe and all, but the benches were empty. The gavel was missing. I stood alone, speaking into a void. When I woke up, I sat at the edge of my bed for nearly an hour, just listening to the wind against the old windows. Was this what justice felt like in the end? Silent? Heavy? I didn't know. But I did know I wasn't going to die a fool in their eyes. I would not let that be my final chapter. Isabel and Mateo began to grow bolder. Isabel started bringing appraisers under the guise of friends passing by. One woman lingered too long in the music room, eyeing the antique piano Teresa adored. I walked in, shuffled deliberately, and said, "It's out of tune." The woman jumped. Isabel faked a cough. I smiled inside. Mateo began making calls from my study when he thought I was asleep. I never said a word. I just took note, quietly, meticulously. Then one evening, they arrived together, unannounced. That was rare. Mateo usually found reasons to avoid staying long, and Isabel preferred to come solo so she could criticize the house uninterrupted. But this time they were coordinated, like lawyers about to deliver closing arguments. I sat in my usual armchair and waited. "Papa," Mateo began, "we've been thinking. It might be time to consider a home, somewhere with proper care, nurses, safety." Isabel interrupted. "And people your age, Papa. You shouldn't be alone all the time." I feigned surprise, then fear, then confusion. "Are you sending me away?" I asked, voice small. Isabel kneeled beside me like a priest delivering a blessing. "It's for your safety," she whispered. "We've already scheduled a visit." "Just to see?" I turned my face away from her and stared at the fireplace. "I see," I said. letting the words hang. In truth, I saw everything. Every plan, every lie, every insult disguised as concern. Their hands were already reaching for the silver before my body was cold. When they left that night, I sat in the dark for hours. I didn't cry. I haven't cried in decades, but I did feel something rupture, a quiet, final snapping of an invisible thread between father and child. It hurt in a way that didn't sting, but sank, deeper than bones. It was grief, I suppose, the mourning of a relationship long dead but only now buried. I stared at the clock until midnight, then stood up, walked to my desk, and locked the journal. I was done recording. The story had written itself. The next morning I called Francisco and told him everything was ready. He confirmed the will was secure, the letter sealed, the trust arranged. "Camilo," he asked, "do you want to leave any room for reconciliation?" I chuckled. "The law doesn't recognize sentiment, only action. Let the will speak." He didn't press further. He knew me too well. After we hung up, I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the city breathe. The hard part was done. Now, all I had to do was live long enough to let fate catch up. The following weeks passed like chapters in a slow, predictable book. Isabel continued dropping by with her veiled curiosity, commenting on how dusty the place had become, how dangerous the stairs looked, how tragic it would be if something happened while I was alone. I nodded, sometimes even thanking her for the concern. Mateo was more impatient. He brought printed brochures of retirement homes, some of them insultingly clinical. "They have scheduled activities," he insisted. "Painting, classes, bingo, even massage therapy." I chuckled. "Will they teach me how to plead insanity too?" I spent more time in the garden. My hands still remembered how to care for the roses Teresa planted. The red ones always bloomed later, as if resisting the seasons. I liked that. Some days I would pretend to lose my balance while trimming a branch, letting Mateo rush in with concern. "Maybe we should take those shears away," he muttered once. I didn't respond. I simply handed them to him and watched how uneasy he became with the weight of something real. Then came the day Isabel brought a man into my home without asking. She called him an estate advisor, but the moment I shook his hand, I knew he was a broker. He looked at the walls like a predator studying a map. "Original tiling?" he asked, running his finger along the corridor. I said nothing. I wanted to see how far they would go. Isabel followed him around like a hostess at an open house, describing the history of each room, as if it already belonged to her. I stood in the doorway and watched my life narrated in past tense. That evening, I locked my bedroom door for the first time in 40 years. I wasn't afraid of harm. I was afraid of erosion, the slow, steady wearing down of dignity. It starts with a skipped question, a repeated sentence, an offered arm you didn't ask for, and then one day, you wake up, and the world has decided you no longer know who you are. But I did. I knew exactly who I was, and exactly who they were. My children had made me invisible while my mind was still sharp. They didn't deserve the man I had been, nor the legacy I still held. I started writing again. Not legal briefs, not journal entries. Letters. To people I respected. To former students. To the foundation board. In each I left pieces of myself. Wisdom, warnings, reflections. A legacy, I wrote to one young judge, is not what you leave behind. It's what you prevent others from destroying. The act of writing revived something in me. It was no longer about punishment, it was about preservation of values, of memory, of who I was before they tried to rewrite me. One day, I walked into the study and found Mateo at my desk. He had my ledger open, the one where I tracked my investments. He froze when he saw me. "I was just looking for a pen," he stammered. I didn't react. I walked past him, sat down, and opened the drawer he hadn't noticed, the one that held nothing of value, but made a loud, locking noise. When opened, he flinched. "Everything all right, Hijo?" I asked gently. He left the room within seconds. That was the last time he entered the study uninvited. It was working. The performance. They were beginning to doubt their timing. Isabel canceled one of her planned appraisals. Mateo started calling less. They were circling slower now, unsure if the prey was truly weak or just playing dead. I had given them just enough rope. The knot was tightening. Then came the letter, a formal envelope, with Mateo's handwriting delivered by courier. Inside was a printed evaluation request to the civil court, arguing for a mental health assessment on the grounds of suspected cognitive decline. It was signed by both him and Isabel. No call, no conversation, just a legal maneuver delivered like a birthday card. I read it twice, slowly, then placed it in the center of the dining table where the Murillo used to hang. I poured myself a glass of mezcal, raised it slightly, and whispered to the empty room. "They've filed the motion. It begins." Francisco came the next day. I showed him the letter. He sighed, ran a hand through his thinning hair and said, "They're accelerating things." I nodded. "Then we will too." We reviewed the documents again. Every line of the will, every instruction. The foundation had already agreed to accept the donation and honor Teresa's name by creating a legal literacy program for women. My grandchildren's trust was fully funded and airtight. Francisco closed the folder and said, "You've outmaneuvered them, Camilo. Just be ready for the performance of your life." The court date was set 2 weeks later. I wasn't summoned, not yet, but I knew how this worked. They'd begin with affidavits, anecdotal evidence, a doctor's testimony based on a single casual visit. Isabel even tried to stage one, inviting a neurologist to dinner without telling me. "He's just an old friend," she smiled. I played along, asked where I was 4 times in 1 hour, pretended to forget Teresa's name. When the doctor left, I wiped my eyes and whispered to her, "Sometimes it's like she never existed." Isabel looked away. I don't know if she felt guilt, but I know she felt something. That night, I called Francisco again. "If anything happens to me before the court date," I said, "make sure the documents are executed immediately." He promised. He also reminded me to be careful. "They're not violent," I said, "just greedy, and greed blinds." Still, I began locking more than just the bedroom door, the safe in the study, the drawer with my journals. I kept a second phone hidden beneath the kitchen tiles. Paranoia? Maybe. But paranoia is just realism, with better timing. A week before the court hearing, I invited both of them for dinner. "Just the 3 of us," I said, like old times. Isabel wore pearls. Mateo wore cologne. They arrived smiling, unaware. I cooked Teresa's favorite, chicken and mole negro with rice and squash blossoms. The house smelled like 1982. We sat at the long dining table, toasted with wine I knew they'd inherited in their minds 1,000 times already. "To family," I said. They clinked their glasses. I didn't drink. We ate slowly. I asked about their lives, pretended I cared about Mateo's consulting business and Isabel's networking brunches. I nodded through lies, laughed at rehearsed jokes. Then I told a story, one they hadn't heard in decades, about the time I defended a judge falsely accused of bribery. I detailed how the real culprit was his son, and how the father covered for him until the truth was undeniable. "And what happened to the son?" Isabel asked, half interested. I looked at her over my glass and said, "He got exactly what he deserved, but not when he expected it." The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. Mateo shifted in his chair. Isabel's smile tightened. They knew somehow. Not the specifics, but the scent of something brewing. I cleared the table, served flan, and told them I'd be attending the hearing myself. "Are you sure you're up for it, Papa?" Mateo asked. "I'm old," I said. "Not dead." It was the first honest sentence I'd spoken to them in months. When they left, I sat on the porch under the yellow porch light Teresa always said made the garden look like a painting. I lit a cigar, let it burn slowly, and watched the shadows stretch across the tiles. This was no longer just about justice. It was about restoring order, the kind of order I spent a lifetime upholding, in courtrooms. If I let them succeed, everything I believed in would crumble. So I puffed once more and whispered, "Not on my watch." The day of the hearing arrived with a sky full of gray clouds and the smell of wet earth lingering from the previous night's rain. I woke up early, dressed slowly, deliberately, a dark navy suit, the same one I wore at Teresa's funeral, a white shirt pressed with care, and my late father's cufflinks. I looked in the mirror and saw a man the world had tried to retire, not because he was unfit, but because he made them uncomfortable. I was tired, yes, but not defeated. never defeated. Francisco picked me up at 9 sharp. We didn't speak much during the drive, just classical music humming through the old car's speakers. When we arrived, I saw them. Isabel in black trying to look solemn. Mateo adjusting his tie too often, eyes darting like a child before an exam. I stepped out of the car slowly, cane in hand, posture slightly bent. Let them think I'm fragile, I thought. Let them underestimate me one last time. The judge presiding was someone I had mentored years ago, Judge Rivas. We exchanged a glance when I entered. No words, just a brief nod. The court clerk announced the case, a petition for legal guardianship based on suspected cognitive decline. My children were the petitioners. I was the respondent. But deep down, I knew. I was also the witness, the prosecutor, and in many ways, the executioner of this charade. They spoke first. Isabel with her carefully crafted concern, citing missed appointments, repeated stories, confusion about money. Mateo chimed in with anecdotes and evidence, a printout of a bank transaction I supposedly forgot. They had rehearsed this, scripted every word. Then the doctor spoke. He described our dinner meeting, emphasizing my memory lapses. He seemed emotionally distressed, he said. I wanted to applaud. He was right. I was distressed by the performance around me. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, gripping the cane for dramatic effect. Your Honor, I began. I may forget where I put my glasses, but I remember the Constitution. I may forget what day it is, but I remember what integrity looks like, and I remember betrayal, especially when it comes from your own blood. Gasps echoed. Isabel's jaw tightened. Mateo looked away. I pulled a folded letter from my coat pocket. This is a sworn affidavit from Francisco Beltran, a notary public. In it, I outline the manipulation I've endured for over a year. I handed it to the bailiff. Your Honor, I continued, the people petitioning for my protection have tried repeatedly to access my finances, move me from my home, and sell my belongings, all under the guise of care. Then I turned to my children, and I let them. I let them because I needed them to show who they truly are. My voice was calm, measured, years of courtroom control, sharpening each syllable. Judge Rivas took her time reading the affidavit. She looked over the supporting documents Francisco had submitted earlier, the will, the journal excerpts, the trust agreements. Then she turned to my children. Do you have any comment? Isabel tried to speak but faltered. Mateo cleared his throat, but no sound came. Their silence was louder than any argument. Rivas leaned back and said, the court finds no evidence of incompetence. Petition denied. Mr. Vargas, your autonomy is intact. The gavel struck, just once, but it echoed like thunder. We walked out of the courtroom into a drizzle. Francisco offered me an umbrella. I waved it off. The rain felt good, cleansing. Isabel and Mateo didn't follow me. They stayed behind, whispering, calculating their next move maybe, but it didn't matter anymore. I had won, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity, out of love, for myself, for Teresa, for everything we built, and out of the unbearable need to remind the world that dignity has no expiration date. When I returned home that afternoon, the silence felt different, not empty but earned. For the first time in months, I sat in my armchair without rehearsing a lie in my head. I looked around the house, the paintings, the books, the faint scent of lavender Teresa used to sprinkle in the hallway. It was all still mine, not because I fought for it, but because I endured the slow erosion and chose to respond with intelligence instead of fury. The war had ended, and I was still standing. That evening, Isabel called. I didn't answer. Then came a message. We need to talk. I ignored it. 2 hours later, Mateo knocked at the door. I didn't open. I wasn't ready, and perhaps I never would be. I sat in the dark, holding Teresa's old shawl, remembering how she used to say, sometimes the best answer is no answer at all. That night I slept with the windows open. Let the city come in. Let life continue. I was no longer hiding from anything. Days passed. I returned to my routines, read the paper every morning, brewed coffee strong, enough to wake ghosts. I even started attending legal lectures again, sitting quietly in the back watching young lawyers quote cases I once ruled on. Some recognized me, others didn't. It didn't matter. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to feel alive again. in a room where justice still meant something, even if only in theory. One day, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. It was from my granddaughter, Ana Lucia. She had heard about the court hearing, apparently. Children talk. Schools whisper. Abuelo, she wrote, I'm sorry for what my parents did. I don't understand everything, but I know it was wrong. I hope I can still visit you. I read that letter a dozen times. Her words were clumsy, but honest. Pure. I wrote back immediately. This house will always be open to you, Ana. You are my legacy. She visited the next weekend, alone, just 13 years old, with braces and eyes too wise for her age. We made hot chocolate and sat in the garden. She asked questions. About law, about Teresa, about what really happened. I didn't hide anything. Sometimes, I told her, the hardest truth is that love isn't always returned the way we give it, but that doesn't make it wrong to love. She nodded, silent, holding my hand. In that moment, I felt hope. It became a new ritual. Ana Lucia came every Sunday. Sometimes she brought her little brother Santiago. We planted herbs, cooked simple meals, laughed at my bad jokes. They saw me not as the fragile old man their parents painted, but as a grandfather, a real one. I began to feel something shift inside, not just peace, but forgiveness. Not for Isabel and Mateo, but for myself, for letting it get that far, for doubting my worth. Francisco visited again. He brought documents to finalize the foundation transfer. Are you sure? He asked. I nodded. They tried to take everything I built. I won't let them take my purpose too. We signed together at the kitchen table, over cups of bitter coffee and old memories. The foundation would bear my name and Teresa's. It would fund scholarships, legal aid, and pensions for elderly judges. Something meaningful, something that would outlive betrayal. That night, I reopened my journal. The one I'd locked after the betrayal was clear. I wrote only one line. Justice is not a thunderclap. It is the slow, deliberate sound of a pen writing what should never be forgotten. Then I closed it again, for good this time. It was around that time I stopped referring to the house as mine and started calling it ours again. Mine and Teresa's. Her presence had never left, not really. It was in the way the light hit the stairwell in the morning, in the creak of the floorboard just outside the kitchen, in the tiny ceramic birds she placed along the windowsill. She would have hated what Isabel and Mateo became, but she would have understood my restraint. She always said true power was knowing you could destroy and choosing not to. Word of what happened at the hearing spread in quiet circles. Old colleagues, neighbors, even one former prosecutor I hadn't spoken to in over a decade called to say, "You still have it, Camilo." I chuckled. I wasn't sure what it was. Maybe the capacity to stand, or maybe just the nerve to do so when it matters. The truth is, I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like an old man who refused to surrender to silence. That's all. Isabel sent flowers weeks later. No card, just lilies. Teresa's favorite. I didn't respond. Mateo sent an email with a subject line that read, "Let's talk." I deleted it. Forgiveness, I had learned, doesn't require an audience. Sometimes it's just the absence of hatred. And in my heart, there was no more hate, only distance. And distance is its own kind of justice. One morning I found Ana Lucia in the study, flipping through an old law journal. "Did you really write all these?" she asked. I nodded. "Before you were born, before your parents made their choices, before I realized legacy wasn't about things, but about the people who carry your name with dignity." She smiled, eyes wide. "Will you teach me?" I laughed, genuinely, for the first time in a long time. "Yes," I said, "if you promise to be better than all of us." From that day on, I began tutoring her every Thursday afternoon. At first, it was just basics, logic, language, history. Then we moved on to case analysis. She took notes like a sponge, asked questions that startled me with their precision. She reminded me of myself, but sharper, more empathetic. Teresa would have adored her. I told Ana that once, and she replied, "I already feel like I know her." I didn't say it out loud, but in that moment, I believed Teresa was still here, in her. One Thursday after class, Ana asked, "Are you still angry at Mama?" The question floated between us like a fragile glass. I took my time. "Not angry," I said. "Just clear." She seemed confused. "Clear about what?" I looked her in the eye. "About who people are when they think no one's watching." about what love really means, and about what I deserve, not as a father but as a man. She nodded slowly. Do you think she regrets it? I exhaled. Maybe, maybe not. But regret doesn't rebuild what's already collapsed. Sometimes when a house falls, you don't repair it. You build something new next to the ruins and you let the wind carry away the dust. She leaned her head on my shoulder. We sat like that in silence. And for the first time since this began, I felt something close to peace. That night I stood in the garden and looked up at the sky. The stars were faint behind the glow of the city, but one shone brighter than the rest. I don't know why, but I whispered thank you. Not to anyone in particular, just to the night, to the silence, to the universe that had given me just enough time to rewrite the ending. The following month, I was invited to speak at the Faculty of Law at UNAM. An old colleague had heard about my case and thought it would be a lesson in elder rights and silent resilience. I hesitated at first, not because I couldn't do it, but because part of me feared returning to that arena where I once held command. But Ana Lucia insisted. You have stories that matter, abuelo, she said. So I went, and for the first time in years I stood at a podium and the room went still. I didn't read from notes. I spoke from memory. I told them about the law, about the gray spaces where legality and morality wrestle. I told them that sometimes the hardest cases aren't the ones in court, but the ones around our own dinner tables. That betrayal in a courtroom wounds your reputation, but betrayal in a family, that wounds your soul. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then came the applause, not out of obligation, but recognition. I walked off that stage lighter than I had been in months. After the lecture, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. My father is going through something similar, she said. They're trying to put him in a home. He's not even 70. I placed a hand on her shoulder. Speak up for him, I said, before they write him out of his own life. She nodded. I gave her Francisco's contact. That night I realized that my story, painful as it had been, now served a purpose beyond my own redemption. At home, I began organizing my papers again. Not just legal documents, but letters, photos, notes Teresa had written in the margins of cookbooks. I created boxes for Ana Lucia. One, labeled personal, another professional, and a third marked, for when I'm gone. I wasn't planning on dying anytime soon, but I had come to understand that legacy isn't what you leave when you die. It's what you prepare while you live. Every label was an act of love. Every folder, a stitch in the fabric of remembrance. Then came Isabel. She showed up one morning without calling, standing at the gate with sunglasses on, and a stiffness in her shoulders I hadn't seen before. I opened the door, but said nothing. She stepped inside and looked around like she was walking through someone else's home, which in a way she was. I heard you spoke at the university, she said. Congratulations. I nodded. Silence filled the hallway. I didn't come to fight, she added, removing her glasses. Her eyes were red. I came because I don't know who I am anymore. That sentence cracked something. I led her to the kitchen and made tea. We sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes before she said, I was angry at you for so long, for being distant, for loving Mama more than us, for choosing your work over everything. Her voice trembled, and when I thought you were slipping, I saw an opportunity. I told myself I was helping, but really I wanted control. I wanted to punish you for not being the father I thought I deserved. Her hands shook. I didn't interrupt. I let her speak. When she finished, I said only this. I wasn't the father you wanted. I was the one I knew how to be. And when you tried to take everything, I didn't stop you because I hated you. I stopped you because I still believed you could be better. She cried then. Not the elegant tears of a woman in control, but the heaving sobs of someone finally releasing years of denial. I didn't hug her. I just sat with her. That was enough. When she left, she kissed my cheek. Thank you for not shutting the door, she whispered. I didn't say, you're forgiven. I didn't say anything. Forgiveness is a slow fire. It warms, but it takes time. Still, that morning felt different, like maybe something had been saved. Not the past, but the future. And that was more than I ever expected. 2 weeks later, Mateo showed up. Not at the door, at the garden gate, where I was watering Teresa's red roses. He didn't ring. He just stood there waiting like a child unsure if he was welcome. I didn't wave him in. I simply nodded. That was enough for him to walk through. His hair was more disheveled than usual, and he looked thinner. "I'm not here for money," he said immediately. "I know," I replied, not looking at him. He sat on the old bench Teresa used to sunbathe on. "I messed up," he said quietly. "I got lost somewhere between debt and pride. I thought if I could just take control of everything, I could fix my life." I didn't speak. He continued, "I blamed you for not saving me from myself. But the truth is, I didn't want your help. I wanted your surrender." That line hit harder than he probably meant it to. "And now?" I asked. "Now," he sighed. "I just want peace." We talked for an hour, about nothing and everything. I asked about Santiago. He lit up when he spoke about his son. "He's good at drawing," he said, smiling slightly. "He gets that from Mama." I told him Ana Lucia had been visiting. He nodded, then looked away. "She's always had your spine," he muttered. Before leaving, he looked me in the eye and said, "You don't have to trust me again. I just want you to know I'm trying." I watched him walk away without asking for anything. That alone was already different. That evening I updated my journal one last time. Not with facts, but with feelings. I wrote about how grief doesn't always wear black. Sometimes it wears suits and speaks like family. I wrote about how betrayal changes you, but so does the silence that follows. And I wrote that letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It just means choosing not to carry what no longer feeds you. I closed the book and placed it in the "for when I'm gone" box. The next Sunday, Ana Lucia brought both her parents. I'll admit I was surprised. She must have begged. Or maybe they asked her. Either way, there they were. The four of us, at the long table again, but no masks this time. Just four people with history between them and a small girl trying to build a bridge. We didn't talk about the will, or the court, or the lies. We talked about Teresa, about her laugh, her terrible dancing, her way of burning toast every Sunday like it was tradition. For a moment, I saw them not as my children, but as people, flawed, hurt, trying, and I think they saw me the same way. Not as a vault to be cracked or a judge to be defied, but as a man, a tired man, a proud man, a man who had fought with silence and survived with his name intact. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was human, and sometimes that's the first step. After they left, Ana stayed behind. She helped me wash dishes and hummed one of Teresa's old songs. "Do you think things will go back to normal?" she asked. I dried a plate and said, "I don't believe in normal. I believe in better, and better takes time." She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. Children see things we adults spend our lives trying to ignore. That night, I didn't dream of courtrooms or betrayal. I dreamed of a beach, the one Teresa and I used to visit in Oaxaca. She was there, wearing that ridiculous straw hat that always flew off in the wind. She didn't say anything, just smiled. And in the dream, I smiled too, because somehow I knew she approved of everything I had done. The following week, I received a letter from the foundation confirming the full transfer of assets. The house was now under their stewardship, but I retained the right to live in it until my passing. The funds had been allocated, the programs in Teresa's name already in motion, legal literacy workshops for widows, scholarships for young women in law, and a small pension program for retired judges living below the poverty line. I sat with the letter in my hands, and for a long time I just breathed. It was done. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. There's a quiet satisfaction in seeing something through to the end, not because of anger, but because of conviction. They had tried to erase me before my time, and instead I had etched my values into something bigger than myself. Mateo and Isabel would inherit stories now, not assets, and that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could give them. A reminder that legacy isn't bought, it's earned. That weekend, Ana Lucia came with a folder of her own. She had been writing essays for a school contest about civic duty and justice. "Can you read one?" she asked. I sat on the veranda as she handed me the pages. Her writing was sharp, her arguments precise, but what caught me off guard was the warmth in her words. "Justice begins at home," she wrote, "and sometimes the hardest laws to enforce are the ones we set for the people we love." I had to pause halfway through to wipe my eyes. When she finished, I said, "You've already surpassed me." She smiled proudly. "Not yet, abuelo, but soon." We laughed. That laugh echoed something in me I hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. I no longer existed just to defend what was mine. Now, I existed to pass on what I knew. And that was a different kind of justice. One that didn't need robes or gavels. Just a girl, a notebook, and a heart big enough to carry 2 generations. Autumn arrived quietly. In the city, the jacarandas had long shed their flowers and the days grew shorter. I found myself waking earlier, as if my body sensed time becoming more precious. I began recording short audio messages for Ana Lucia and Santiago, not about money or possessions, but about moments. How Teresa laughed in her sleep, how I won my first trial, how I once fainted in court because I skipped breakfast. The little things that make a man real, not just remembered. One morning, I received a call from the EU, local school. They wanted to name a small library after me, funded in part by the foundation. I declined the ceremony, but I allowed the name. Only, I said, if you include Teresa's name too. The plaque would read, Biblioteca Teresa y Camilo Vargas, por la justicia silenciosa. I didn't care about the recognition. I cared about the message, that sometimes the quietest people leave the loudest echoes. That night, I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls like a man feeling for pulse. Every photo, every piece of furniture, every door frame held a memory. I wasn't sad. I was simply full of time, of love, of silence that no longer hurt. I stopped at the door of the study, placed my hand on the wood and whispered, Gracias. Not to anyone in particular, just to the space that held me through the storm. And then I sat in my armchair, covered my legs with Teresa's shawl, and closed my eyes for a while. Not to sleep, just to rest. The kind of rest that comes after a long trial, when the verdict has been read, and justice, at last, has been served. In December, the house felt colder, but not lonely. Ana Lucia had decorated the front room with simple lights and handmade ornaments. We don't need a tree, she said. This whole place already feels like a story. I smiled and let her arrange everything. Mateo came by with Santiago and helped fix a broken shutter. He didn't talk much, but he stayed for coffee. Isabel sent a basket of fresh bread and tamales. No note. This time, just the gesture. It was enough. On Christmas Eve, we had dinner in the garden. A small table, just the 5 of us. I prepared Teresa's recipe for romeritos. I burned the garlic like she always did, and Ana laughed, saying it smelled like memory. We ate slowly under yellow lights strung between the trees. No one mentioned the past. No one apologized. We just shared the space, the food, the moment. It wasn't healing. It was something softer, like stitching fabric you thought was too torn to mend. After the meal, Ana handed me a small box. Inside was a wooden gavel she had carved herself. On the handle, she had etched the words, "For the man who judged with silence and loved with patience." I held it in my hands for a long time, then looked up at her with tears that didn't need explaining. That night, I placed it on the bookshelf in the study, next to my old robe and the last photo Teresa and I took together. January came with quiet mornings and long walks in the garden. I moved more slowly now, but with intention. Every step felt like a choice. I no longer rushed anything. I took pleasure in folding my shirts, watering the plants, slicing fruit. These rituals, once mundane, had become sacred. The noise of ambition, of fear, of betrayal, all of it had settled into a silence that no longer frightened me. I had learned how to live inside it. One afternoon, I began drafting a final letter. Not legal, not formal, but deeply personal. It was addressed to no one and everyone. A confession, perhaps, or a farewell. In it, I wrote about power and its illusions, about love, and how it doesn't always return but still leaves a mark. I wrote that revenge, when born of pride, poisons, but when born of clarity, it purifies. I signed it simply, Camilo Vargas, citizen. I placed it in the same envelope as Teresa's letters, a conversation across time. As the days passed, I noticed how much less I expected from the world. Not out of sadness, but contentment. I had faced betrayal without becoming bitter. I had held my ground without shouting. I had rewritten a story others tried to finish for me. What more could I ask for? I had lived a life of structure, of rules, of careful thought. But in these final chapters, I had discovered something new, softness. And in softness, there is incredible strength. I never told Isabel and Matteo about the details of the will. They'll find out one day, after I'm gone, when the letter is read and the silence speaks louder than my voice ever could. Perhaps they'll be angry. Perhaps they'll understand. But that's not mine to control anymore. My part was to leave the truth behind, and I did. Not to hurt, but to teach. To draw a line between love and entitlement, between presence and possession. And when they sit in the lawyer's office someday expecting numbers and receiving words instead, I hope in some distant part of them, they feel what I felt in that courtroom. That justice doesn't always arrive with fury. Sometimes it arrives in an envelope, signed, sealed, and silent. One night I awoke around 3 a.m., not startled, just awake. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. I walked slowly to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and sat in the armchair by the window. The moonlight spilled across the tiles like milk, and I thought about time. Not how much was left, but how much had been used well. That's a rare feeling, I think. Most people only feel regret. I felt completion. I remembered a moment from years ago. Teresa dancing in the living room to a song on the radio, barefoot, hair pinned up, humming off-key. I had laughed then, but now the memory brought tears, not of loss, but of deep gratitude. We had built something real. Flawed, yes, but real. And though she was gone, and the walls bore the marks of time, the love remained, stitched into everything, even the pain. The next morning I wrote a short note and taped it inside the kitchen cabinet, the one above the cups. If you're reading this, it said, then I'm already where Teresa is. Don't be sad. Drink a good cup of coffee and remember that silence, too, can be an act of love. I signed it with a smiley face. Not because I was trying to be funny, but because Teresa always said my handwriting looked too serious. I began organizing my final affairs. I canceled subscriptions, donated old clothes, wrote down passwords and labeled drawers. I even called Francisco to thank him, not for his service, but for his loyalty. You were the first to believe me, I told him, even when I pretended not to believe in myself. He laughed. You were never pretending, Camilo. You were preparing. That stuck with me. Perhaps I had been preparing my whole life for this season of stillness. Ana Lucia came over that afternoon. She brought warm pan dulce and a new notebook. I want to write your story, abuelo, she said, but from my voice. Is that okay? I nodded. Right. What's true, I told her. Even if it hurts. She smiled. I will. We spent hours talking. She asked questions I had never been asked, not by journalists, not by students, not even by Teresa. Questions about fear, about failure, about what I regretted. Not trusting myself sooner, I told her. That's the only one. That night she stayed late. We lit candles and played Teresa's old records. When she finally stood to leave, she hugged me tightly and said, "You were never invisible to me." I held her face and said, "That's because you saw with the heart." After she left, I sat in silence, letting the music linger. I didn't feel old. I felt distilled, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, and what remained was the core of who I had always been. In the days that followed, I wrote small farewell letters, one for each of them. For Ana Lucia, a letter full of encouragement. For Santiago, stories of childhood and drawings I had saved. For Isabel, a single page that simply said, "You are not what you took, you are what you choose to become after." For Matteo, a letter folded in 3, with one line bolded, "You tried to break me, and instead, I broke the cycle." And finally, I wrote one last entry, not in my journal, but in my heart. It wasn't about law, or betrayal, or legacy. It was about peace, a kind of peace I had thought would never find me again. But it had, not in triumph, not in punishment, but in clarity, quiet, certain, and earned. On a crisp morning, in late February, I woke with a strange calm in my chest, the kind you feel before a storm or maybe after one. I made my coffee, buttered a slice of toast, and sat by the window. The street was quiet. Even the birds seemed to be moving slower. I took my time, chewed slowly, sipped even slower. I looked around the room, at the light crawling across the tiles, at the mug in my hand, and whispered, "This is enough." And for the first time in a long time, I meant it. I spent that day writing. Nothing. Saying little. Just observing. I watched Santiago chase a ball in the garden. I listened to Ana Lucia read aloud on the patio. I saw their lives unfolding in the very spaces that once echoed with strategy and suspicion. Now they held laughter. That was the future I had wanted. Not wealth, not power, but peace that echoed in ordinary things. Before sunset, I climbed the stairs slowly and opened the window in Teresa's old sewing room. The city stretched out in every direction, buzzing, gently with life. In the distance, the bells from a church rang and I closed my eyes. Each toll felt like punctuation to a story I had fought to write myself. I smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because I had made it to the end without surrendering my truth. That evening, Ana Lucia helped me to bed. She tucked me in like I once did for her as a baby. "Buenas noches, abuelo," she whispered. "Te quiero." I held her hand and said, "Promise me something." She nodded. "Promise you'll live with your eyes open, even when it hurts." Her voice cracked. "I promise." I let go, not of her hand, of the fear. The story was safe with her now. I don't remember falling asleep, just the softness of the pillow, the warmth of the blanket, and a final thought, that justice isn't always served in courts. Sometimes it lives in the decisions we make quietly, in the lines we refuse to cross, in the dignity we defend, even if no one applauds. That's the kind of justice that outlives us. When I was gone, the letters were opened, the will was read, and true to what I had written, there were no dramatic scenes, just silence. A long, still silence that echoed louder than any inheritance ever could. Isabel didn't scream. Mateo didn't plead. They simply nodded, each in their own stunned way. And maybe, just maybe, they finally understood what they tried to take wasn't money, it was identity. And they failed. Ana Lucia took over the house, now a legal literacy center and quiet refuge for those who had no one else. She framed my gavel above the main entrance with a plaque that read, "The man who never raised his voice, but changed everything." And every month, she reads aloud from my journals to groups of young students, letting my words continue walking, even after I no longer could. This is the last page of my story, not because there's nothing left to say, but because I've said what mattered. I didn't die a victim. I didn't die forgotten. I died heard. And in a world so full of noise, that might be the loudest victory of all. If you've stayed with me until the end, know that this story is about something many of us have felt. The quiet fight to hold on to our dignity when everything around us seems to crumble. Have you ever been through something like this? Share with me. I want to hear your experiences. Those moments when you had to be strong even when no one else saw. If this story touched you in any way, share it with someone who might relate. Someone facing their own silent battles. Sometimes just knowing we're not alone makes all the difference. And if you want to hear more stories about ordinary people facing real pain and unexpected turns, stay here with me. I promise to bring you tales that speak straight to the heart, just like this one. Thank you for being here until the very end. May Camillo's courage inspire yours, and may silent justice find its place in your life too.